Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video that I'm doing with Christopher Satoor, where, as you already know, Christopher is going to be launching a new course on sPhil, where he's going to be teaching Schelling's freedom essay. But today, I thought that we would just get to know Christopher a little better, um, because it's not just about doing someone's course, it's about getting to know someone, a philosopher, and knowing a bit about their intellectual background, I think is always interesting. So, Christopher, you obviously work on Schelling. Um, so could you tell us a bit about your thesis? What's it? Does it have a title? Uh,
Right now, I mean, so I'm actually writing on Schelling's, he called it his baby at the time, The Ages of the World, which he never finished, actually. So in German, it's the Die Weltelter. There's three drafts that are translated in English currently. There would have been more, but the Allied bombing in 1944 in Berlin ended up ruining 20 I think they said something like 20 versions of it, almost 2,000
well,
manuscripts, pages of manuscripts. So we have some of these edited works, and we also have the edited edition that his son Carl put together. Now, what I'm doing is because this is an unfinished work, and because Schelling takes there's multiple drafts, and there are different scholars in the Schelling scholarship that prefer the first edition or the third edition or the second edition. I'm reading the third edition, so the 1815 draft that his son put together in isolation. Now I'm reading it isolated because this is a kind of mythical, poetic, philosophical work that philosophizes about the beginning of all beginnings, essentially. Now, the question here is like, how do we as human beings philosophize about a beginning that we've never cognized? How do we do that? And because this work um, is so infused with theosophy, so what is theosophy? I'll tell you a second. Theosophy is a philosophical apparatus that even Hegel was introduced to. So writers like Jakob Böhme and Friedrich Christoph Erdinger, as well as even the great Meister Eckhart, who has this language of Grund and then finally to Burma, Ungrund. So there's this great Teutonic tradition in German thought where they're kind of mixing and blending theological, philosophical, but also also kind of a Christian Kabbalah almost language. So, how do you read this text? Well, multiple people read it as a kind of, sometimes they see it as an unfinished work, but I see it as Schelling trying to answer these questions that Hegel has left from the phenomenology of spirit. So, how does self-consciousness emerge from the beginning point? How does nature and spirit come together? And what I've done actually is I'm taking Ernst Cassir's philosophy of symbolic form, the way that he shows how mythic consciousness is part of filling in the content of cognition. And so I'm saying essentially that Schelling is using this kind of mythic consciousness to talk about the emergence of self-consciousness, the emergence of how nature and matter came together. Not in a kind of spiritual way, but in a way of filling in that content, that cognition, that cognitive content. And so I'm going through all of these phases. Of course, there's a kind of a very, speculative uh, theological element to the work as well too. Of course, Schelling and both Hegel are working in this kind of very Lutheran Christian background, and Schelling is little has a lot of the elements of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and so he sees these three unfolding, but unfolding like First nature unfolds, and then matter and nature come together, and then finally the human being. But so he has multiple drafts, and essentially what he's saying is that first, so history is first prophesized to us. And from that prophecy, it's intimated. It becomes, in a sense, dormant in our consciousness. But he says, what would happen if we kind of like took all of history from its most unconscious moment and kind of filled in all of this? And so I'm essentially showing that you can take the ages of the world in isolation through Cassir's mythic consciousness and read the ages of the world as this emergent, I don't want to say phenomenology, emergent philosophy, maybe speculative philosophy of first nature, the cosmos, and then finally the human being, humans coming to understanding this great prophecy from nature to spirit. Sorry if that was all over the place.
No, no, it's all right. I mean, that's how it is when you're describing your research. Um, so just some questions. So what do we mean by mythic consciousness? What's that?
Yes, fantastic. Well, for Schelling, and a lot of the students are probably going to have to kind of grasp this element. When Schelling talks about mythology, or when Schelling uses theosophical or theological imagery, he does it in order to make the concept he's working on, right? Making a little more clearer and vivid for philosophy. Now, for Cassirer, mythic consciousness is inherently a part of human nature. So art, mythology, language, all of these elements are part of cognition. They're all part of it. And he's got a kind of neo-Kantian structure. So he sees the world building concept as an extension of Kant's, transcendental logic. He's extending that into this kind of world building concept. And that's what Schelling's doing. He's taking this world concept. Now, what is a world, right? We can think of this in a Heideggerian sense where the world doesn't mean the earth. The world means all of this information that puts you and I together. You and I talking about a framework, right? We're talking about German idealism, we're talking about Hegel and Schelling, and you already know all of these cues, right? You know Hegel well, you know Hegel through Schelling. So we have this framework of this world already built in. And so he wants to look at that, where that framework came from, where this world concept is built, where it starts. And so he goes, first of all, through Plato's Timaeus. He has these really beautiful imagery of the Timaeus, right? The grand artesian or the demiurgos, right? Unfolding the cosmos, ensouling the planets, right? And he's talking about the same kind of process that what mythic consciousness allows is revelation, but not theological revelation, revelation of the world to human consciousness. So it's something that for me I found really fascinating that it didn't have to just have this religious reading. It could also have this kind of revealing of logical or cognitive content for all of us as a framework. So mythic consciousness is that building that world concept. And I'm talking with my hands, so apologies for that. It looks like I'm
That's all
playing tennis.
And that's like so the idea is something so like we're sort of we're born into a pre-existing structure, right? A concept is it a conceptual structure?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And this whole structure, this whole pre-existing conceptual structure is the world concept.
Right.
So something like that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And it's
It's quite
funny.
similar to Hegel, right? In this regard, in a sense.
Yes, very much so. And Schelling had planned to write three books, past, present, future. So the past is the unconscious element of this world concept, right? Of this, you know, the the product or the element that's uncognized, bringing it to the fore. And the present would be, what this, this element now as self-consciousness or as consciousness, right? From unconscious to consciousness. And
Mhm.
then the future would be, well, he never finished. We have blueprints of the present, but we don't have blueprints of the future. And so essentially what Schelling does is he scraps this entire project and um, what he does is he creates what he calls the philosophy of revelation and philosophy of mythology. And so he sees mythology in the later work as a history of nature, right? He sees like Kronos eating his children and all of these epic tales in mythology as real processes happening in nature and us using the kind of structure of the story, structure of oral presentation as a way of dealing with these forces and intensities because we didn't have the language to deal with it at the time.
Mhm. Yeah. Very, again, I mean, obviously Hegel and Schelling are all drinking from the same sort of intellectual
Yes.
fountain, right? Because Hegel also has this strong idea of art and religion being sort of not preconceptual, but non-conceptual forms of conceiving of the idea, um, and sort of ways to sort of help people maybe come closer to the world or to understand the world or as a ladder on the way maybe to philosophy. Um, so yeah, interesting parallel there.
Yeah.
And
No,
in these ages of the world, it's is it anything remotely similar to Hegel's philosophy of world history, or it's much more, as you said, sort of past, present, future, not like China, India, Persia?
that's a really good question. You see, Schelling answers, well, I'm going to just say this out loud, just probably annoy all the Schellingians. Schelling at one point will literally say that Hegel wins. Hegel won the battle of idealism, but really essentially what we now have to do is create a kind of philosophy of existence. And in that philosophy of existence, he ties everything. He brings in the philosophy of mythology. But this Ages of the World project, it's essentially it doesn't have any specific historical events.
Yeah.
It's very much abstracted or abstracted from the point of view of building this world concept as it emerges. And so he'll use examples from Plato's Timaeus. He'll use examples of from the Bible, from the Torah and the New Testament, especially the creation story. And of course, he uses Jakob Boehme. He uses Boehme's theosophical dialectic about God kind of shrouding the beginning of creation in himself, making it dormant. And in a sense, that knowledge needs to now be unfolded. So it's a little different from Hegel in that sense, but really it's something that he's really trying to, and maybe struggling a bit with to unfold and structure. But he sees something about prophecy, the way that, do I have the book here? Actually, I do. Let me just read one line to you.
Yeah, of course.
The way that he structures it, it's really poetic, actually. He says, the past is known, right? The past is known. The past is known to us as stories, as mythology. The present is discerned, right? It's grasped, it's cognized. The future is intimated, anticipated. The known is narrated, the discerned is presented, and the intimated is prophesized. So we have this movement of the past is known, but how do we know this past? Do we know this past through mythology, through history, through hearsay? How do we know it? And it's a kind of retracing our steps. And he says, that this world concept is the development of a living actual being. So not only do we get the past, the unconscious past, but we get this kind of living cosmos be unfolding towards the finally the creation of the human being. That's now this self-conscious, self-aware being of this past, living in the present, anticipating now the future. I hope I'm not simple making this too simple, but I'm trying to just break it down so there
Yeah.
are little elements of it. Yeah.
So does Schelling have this idea then of um I'm sorry, because my framework is always Hegelian, right? So
No, no, it's
I'm just
totally
trying to
okay.
understand things. So does he have an idea of this conceptual framework, the world concept, as being an actively developing thing, or is it sort of more passive?
It is. It's an actively developing thing. He actually refers to it as an archetype, as the forms, that Plato is almost in a sense um, that Plato is philosophizing of, the contemplative act at first, but then it kind of, yes, it's always slowly emerging. In the system of transcendental idealism, he uses the German Stufenfolge, a kind of ascending or a steps, like a ladder series, and an emerging series of unfolding.
Hmm.
And it's funny, he talks about these three potencies. Now, what is that? The three powers. What is these three potencies that he's talking about? Well, he talks about this wheel of time unfolding. It's so funny. The first unfolding is, you know, it has this very, it has a structure like the Kabbalah in a sense. There's this kind of contraction inward and then expansion, and there's these two principles, A and B, which he obviously gets from Fichte, and this kind of logic of identity. But there's always this moment of these two dormant processes, which he gets both from Fichte and from Burma. So there's this like light and darkness, these two principles that are in everything.
Hmm.
And in a sense, just like with Hegel, they're in constant, they're in showdown mode. They're like UFC mode, battling it out with each other. And one becomes the ground, one comes the foreground. And so this is the structure of nature. He says that all nature, all processes, all life has these dual principles that are, in a sense, always in constant opposition to one another.
Hmm.
And with nature, what happens is that nature is this dynamic process that's always becoming, but it has these points where there's inhibition, and in that moment of inhibition, opposition, life forms. And so he starts off with nature, and then from nature we get spirit, and spirit isn't the Hegelian spirit for him. Spirit is like the identity or the logical content of history or the mythology unfolding, as you said nicely. And they slowly merge. And then finally, the third element is this element of personality, the person. What is the person? How does the person become? How is the person able to posit spirit in nature, finally, in the end? I'm really sorry for being all over the place
No,
here.
no, it's really clear. I mean, honestly, it sounds like I'm uh I'm talking to a cousin in a sense.
Yes.
In the sense that, everything you're saying sounds eerily familiar, slightly different language, slightly different emphasis, but you know, still very
Yeah.
much obviously within the German idealist tradition.
Now,
In,
the only difference I would say between Hegel and Schelling is that Schelling doesn't like this movement of Aufhebung. He doesn't
Mhm.
like sublation.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you about.
This is a very key. I have it tattooed on my arm if you can't see it, but long story. Schelling prefers the German term Aufgehende or Aufgehende, emerging, rising. He thinks that life isn't always in a state of contradiction. We need to uphold the contradictions. And so there's this in the freedom essay, he talks about, he says, der nie aufgehende Rest, or the irreducible remainder, the indivisible remainder. Anyways, but we need to obtain these contradictions. Now, it's not like sublation were to happen where the dark principle and the light principle kind of just fade. No, no. They're in this constant struggle endlessly.
Yeah.
So contradiction needs to be upheld. And for Schelling, where I think Hegel didn't like this element of Schelling, that Schelling sees the third moment of unity as indifference, but not indifference in the point of I'm indifferent to these two principles. The fact that this moment of indifference has both the light and the dark principle equally in unity. And so for Schelling, there always has to be this ground. So I like to give my students this example because sometimes it's really hard to grasp this element. And I say, think of a coin, heads and tails. Now, if we put this in Schellingian terms, heads is only one whole of the one part of the coin. Tails is the other part. But they both make up the same identity. That's the indifference point of the coin, the whole coin. And so for what he's trying to say is that it's you're not always going to get the whole coin as a moment of reality. What you're going to get is these the pivot, right? The pivot between heads and tails.
Hmm.
However, both of them as parts of the whole, right, make up this whole totality, this whole reality. It's like your left and your right hand. I always use this example. They're both the same entity. They're both made of flesh, blood, and bone, but yet oddly they're inverted, right?
Hmm.
They're a mirror image of each other, but in different spatial locations, left, right. And so he wants to always obtain that contradiction. And this is for him, it also happens with the human being. Because when evil happens, when we do evil actions, essentially what's going on is that we are kind of pushing down the universal principle, which would be like the Kantian maxim, like, the see everyone as an end in themselves. And
Okay.
evil for him is this idea of essentially like where we put ourselves above everyone else. So we do the same movement that was at the beginning of the ages, where we contract inward into ourselves, that kind of. So there is this kind of mystical element to him. I hate
Hmm.
using that word, but there he uses this language that a lot of the students are going to need to get to used to
Yeah.
because, for Hegel, the brilliance about Hegel is that when you're reading Hegel, he writes in such a dialectical way, such a brilliant, logical, dialectical way that you can follow him. You can see every point. Now, it's brutal at first, but then when you get into him and you love reading what you're reading, you can see the structure of what he's doing. Schelling uses a lot more imagery to grasp that tension.
So this is actually something that I wanted to ask about because this idea of these two principles that are always present, that's obviously a very un-Hegelian idea. Hegel doesn't like the idea of essential principles that are sort of permanently in place that act as the ground for everything. But what you said that the way you were conceptualizing the moment of indifference, which is the moment of unity, that was I want to ask more about that because that was interesting. So I gather he calls it indifference because it is indifferent to the sort of the singularity of the two moments.
Yes.
Okay.
They have to be, they are both part of the whole, but equally individuated. So they are still equally individual, personal, yet part of this whole.
Hmm.
He gives a really great example. He gives this example that is straight from Burma, Jakob Burma. He says a human being can be loving at one moment and wrathful at the next. And yet both moments, both singular moments are completely different, but make up the same entity, make up the same identity. So
Hmm.
you're right. You're right. Yeah.
So right, okay. So you can be wrathful at one moment, you can be loving at the other moment. Um, and I guess the Schellingian conceptualization of this possibility is not that, or maybe it is, maybe I've misunderstood. It's not that they're united in the same person, it's that they're both they're they're individually true and can be individually true whilst occurring within the same being, but not at the same
Yes.
time.
100%. 100%. He gives a really great example, a really even better example of this. In the Freedom Essay, when he talks about the human being and each organ that makes up the whole, like our coin example, he says when your eye is sick, when you get like pink eye or something, your whole body's not sick. It's just the one part, right? The eye, right? Or your throat.
Hmm?
But still, and that one element is still individuated. It's still, it's different from the rest, but still part. So it still has its own individual identity, and yet it's still made up within the whole. And now, of course, he really wants to stress this because of Hegel's criticism, right, of in the phenomenology of spirit, where Hegel makes his famous statement about um, he's making a comment about both Schelling's concept of intellectual intuition and the absolute, where he thinks that Schelling's absolute is this night where all cows turn black. And Schelling wants to say, look, I have a kind of personalized living concept of the absolute, but at the same time, this whole isn't just this melting pot, this dark night of the abyss or something. It it is there is this moment, there is this one substance or this one, let's say coin. The coin is there, but heads and tails equally have their own identity while making up the totality of it.
Yeah.
Sorry if I was struggling there with getting that
No, no,
right.
I think this is very difficult stuff. It's a very subtle distinction, I think, between Schelling's view and Hegel's view, if I've understood Schelling's view well either. Um, because because Hegel obviously he wants to take the moment of unity and then he wants to build on that, right? And then something he wants to make something new out of that moment of unity. Does Schelling want to do that? Is that how the development occurs for Schelling?
So for Schelling, um, God will always be what he calls absolute indifference or absolute identity. So sorry, God will be absolute identity. God is the whole totality of the coin. And we are in the ground of God. So we are the product, or we are the element, or we are part of that heads and tails moment of the coin. So will he work off the unity? We only find out about the absolute identity at towards the end of the ages of the world and in the freedom essay. Actually, he ends the freedom essay with this ungrund, this unground, this moment, this non-ground that comes before all ground. And essentially, he's rethinking what pantheism is. He's also rethinking Hegel's criticisms, and he's trying to come up with a kind of dynamic, well, I like to think of it as Christian pantheism in a sense. Um, how can we talk about, being in God, right? And yet still have freedom,
Mm,
right? That's
mm,
the essential problem. And this is why people like Jacobi hate these systems, because they think the moment that you start doing metaphysics or speculative philosophy, you're into Spinozaism. And
mm,
Schelling really wants to play this key. So on the one hand, Schelling's great critics, Spinoza, Jacobi, and Hegel, are making him be very careful about the identity distinction in this unity. So how do we talk about um, each individual product within this moment of unity? What are we talking about?
yeah,
And so he's very careful about that. So we start off with the very smallest parts, and then we finally end with the great whole. Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, yeah. Well, and they're all distinct. Well, yeah. What was my question was about development. Yeah. Um. Yeah. I mean, for example, how does Schelling, for example, let's say, how does he account for, or how does he explain the movement from like inert matter to organic matter? What's his story there?
Oh, great, great. So this is right from his philosophy of nature. So it's funny, the early Schelling, you don't even hear the word God at all. He calls the first principle or nature, he calls it the unconditioned, the unbedingt, which you
Hmm.
could call it unconditioned or unthinged. And it is this kind of absolute productivity. That's what it is. He relates it to an endless becoming of a stream. However, Schelling is also extremely influenced by this really odd English physician named John Brown, who thinks that in reality, there's always this contraction and expansion in all principles. And this will play out in all of his philosophy. Sometimes he calls it gravity and light. Sometimes he calls it darkness and light. Sometimes he calls it, you know, um, inhibition and movement, dynamism and atomism. He sees that nature can't endlessly become. If nature were to endlessly become continually, there would be no products. There
Right.
would be nothing.
Yeah.
So what happens is what we need is this moment of inhibition.
Hmm.
So kind of like how when a stream is pouring out endlessly and it hits a curve in the water or in the stream, um, the rocks push back on this flow of becoming and whirlpools form. So for him, what essentially is happening is that as the infinite is endlessly producing, is this in this production, the moments of inhibition form what he calls, this is where that moment of inorganic and organic come together to form what he calls actants. So the whirlpool, the ripples in the water are actants. He calls those rogue monads, which I think is really cool. So I like looking at it like this.
Hmm.
Think of reality as a body of water. However, the entirety of reality is for human life, plant life is only on the surface because that's where the ripples happen, right? Where you can skip the rock, not at the bottom.
Hmm.
And absolute identity, so real unity, would be the fact that everything is made out of H2O, water.
Hmm.
However, the bubbles on the top, on the surface, they're individuated, um, and at the same time are free to bump into other ripples because of this process. So in a sense, what absolute identity allows is that they are finite entities with the infinite spark written in them. So it's like finite in the infinite form in a
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, so this is how he sees it in his philosophy of nature, and he sees nature unfolding in the same way. However, um, it unfolds through a series of potencies. So a lot of people don't get this right about Schelling. Schelling's not saying that nature is conscious, nature's alive. Nature becomes conscious through human beings.
Hmm.
Like the highest potency, the highest power of nature is when human beings become conscious because we are part of nature.
Hmm.
So I like to think of the first moment of, or the first potency of this absolute production is kind of like in the big prior to the Big Bang, this kind of nebulous of soup, like a nebula where there's just soup endlessly around. The
Hmm.
second potency is the kind of inhibition moment where stars are forming and planets are forming. And then finally it's constantly unfolding and heating up until we get to this point where we finally reach the end where, well, not the end, we reach a point where out of these inhibitions now, we have conscious beings. So this is the slow, I mean, I'm taking like three books and I'm trying to talk about them in 5 minutes. That's okay. I'm trying to show you there's these
Yeah.
processes, but that same tripartite structure
Hmm.
is in the ages as well too. We have the
Hmm.
first potency, which really is the dynamic, the moment of opposition and contraction um, in nature. And it's funny, he says that in this inorganic state, in this moment, in this first potency, nature longs to be alive. It the word he uses in German is Sehnsucht, yearns. It yearns to be alive. And there's this, contractive principle in it, an expansive principle, right? The darkness and light,
Hmm.
right? One, they're fighting with each other to be, it's kind of like in a human being, you're loving one moment and then the wrathful, angry moment kind of arises, and he literally sees the powers in this like that in a sense.
Right.
So, and when one kind of takes over the other becomes its ground. And nature does this for a while. Like, I mean, it
Like
does it for
the back and forth.
the back and forth happens for quite a long time. He calls it, the axis, the axle. He calls it like an ax, like a wheel, the wheel of eternity, he says, in a sense,
Hmm.
until finally. And then we get this kind of very nice, um, this really nice kind of reiteration of the Timaeus in there, the demiurgos
Hmm.
unfolding the cosmos. I'm really sorry
No, no, it
if
sounds
I'm
really.
being a little too abstract. When I teach all of the students, I'll
Hmm.
obviously will not be this abstract and this speculative. I like to use, you know, examples to bring Schelling to a fore. Um, because I mean, you don't have this kind of poetic element in Hegel. That's the great thing about Hegel. He's a
Yeah.
fantastic philosopher.
Yep.
Oh, what you could say? It's almost identical to Hegel in a sense that, the beginning of the phenomenology of spirit where he talks about the plant,
Yep.
the growth of the flower. I think it's the
Hmm.
flower. And he says there's the seed and then finally the plant and then the fruit. It's kind of like that, but the identity of it is still is the entirety of it, right? It's the entirety of the plant
I
and the
think there's nothing wrong with trying to communicate this at a very abstract level. Examples are obviously very helpful, you know. Examples help to situate you sometimes. But fundamentally, you know, it's the abstract. We're talking about concepts, and concepts are
yes.
abstract. And if you're going to understand it properly, I think you have to understand it on a conceptual level fundamentally. Um, so, you know, no need to apologize. It was,
It's really interesting because when you open up the Bible, it talks about God hovering over the void. Schelling is very keen about this. He's a keen reader of the biblical scriptures. And he literally sees that throughout this process, like God is also oddly in a kind of Meister Eckhartian way, also, right? Also developing himself while
Mhm.
humanity is developing itself and the cosmos is developing. So there's a kind of tripartite development going on that he's trying to hammer out. And he calls this the unconscious past because no human being can cognize this element. And yet there are parts and pieces of that uncognized, unconscious material that's in our religious books and literature and also in our mythology. And that's why it's always a mythic consciousness that's always unfolding in this world concept.
Yeah, perfect. And you've brought us back to where we started.
There you go. Yeah.
There you go. It's a perfect way to end this video. Well, Krista, thank you very much for that. That was really elucidating.
Thank you for having me, and I'm really excited about the course.
Looking forward to it as well. Okay, thank you everyone for watching. Bye bye.